Right, the first thing I'm going to do is press 6 on the keyboard, and that opens up the particle view. As you can see, it's actually covering up quite a large section of our perspective view, so I'm going to knock the command panel down to just one column and move this over here a little so we can still see what we're doing. Then let's move this up here a little so it doesn't cover up the timeline, so we can scrub back and forth. That's a little bit better. Okay, there we go. Something I could recommend actually when you're using Macs is that if you have, as an example, a second monitor that you're not using, or even if you can actually afford to buy a second monitor, I'd highly recommend that for use with 3D Studio Max. A number of the editors that come with it will take up a lot of screen space. As an example, when you're rendering, the render view will take up a lot of space. As you can see here, the particle view takes up quite a bit of space. The material editor takes up quite a bit of space. The schematic view and the curve editor both take up a lot of space. So if you're working heavily in any of these disciplines, it really is so much better to actually be able to take your particle view or your material editor, render view, whatever, and actually put those onto a second monitor. And this is something I actually do myself. And once you've used a dual monitor setup, it's pretty hard to go back. But anyway, for now, we're just going to crack around here with just a single display. And let's just quickly run through the various elements of the particle view. It's made up of 4 parts. The main part is the schematic view, which you can see here. I'll just pop something in there so we can actually see how it works. There we go. Middle mouse pans around it, and I think the wheel doesn't actually allow you to zoom in this case, but you can actually put it into zoom mode, and then you can actually zoom in and out of the schematic view. That's quite useful. I'll put it back into pan mode so we can just go back and move around. This is where you'll do all your wiring up of your particle flow, and then when you actually do that, what you do is you actually drag operators from this window, the operator palette, into that window. Let's just resize this a little bit so we've got a bit more space. And you can see down here you've got all the operators that make up particle flow. If particle flow gets extended in the future, then you'll probably find there'll be more operators in this window. Here you have the command panel for particle flow, and in here you'll see various parameters, which is pretty much a mirror of the command panel over here in Standard Max. And the final window is this window here, which is the description window, and you can see that if you select any of the particle flow operators, it gives you a description of exactly what that particle flow operator does. Another thing that you can do to find out about particle flow is to actually look in the Max help and type in particle flow, and there's quite sufficient tutorial in there and a run through to give you an idea of exactly how it works. Okay, you can see that we have a PF source 1, and all particle flows have at least one source. And you can rename that source by right-clicking here, clicking on rename. This is going to be a flame effect, so I'm going to rename this to flame source. And it's a pretty good idea when you're working with particle flow to actually rename your events and your sources to give you an idea of what do they exactly do when you come back to the flow at a later date. Now, the source event basically sets up some basic parameters for that particular flow. For instance, how is it going to render? Will it render the particles, the percentage of the particles in the viewport, percentage at render time, maximum amount of particles, and so forth. So I'm going to increase the upper limit on the particles so we don't run out of particles when we run the simulation. I'm going to change the viewport percentage to 100% so we see all of our particles. And that's it for now. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a birth operator, and particle flow automatically constructs an event around that operator. You can't actually have an operator outside of an event. So we've got event number 1, and we're going to just wire that up to the source. There we go, so we've got a basic flow going on now. If I scrub the timeline, you will see that there are no particles in the scene still, and this is actually the particle flow icon, which if I go to the command panel here, you can see it's got parameters for it, and these mirror the source parameters that we saw over here. You can change the size of the icon here and so forth, so we'll change that to 200. Yeah, so it's a lot larger, and we'll change the size of the icon as well. So there we go, we changed the logo to 50. It's a little bit larger as well. Now, the first thing we need after birthing our particles is a position in space. By default, if you actually create a particle flow in the viewport, that position in space would be based on this icon. But in our case, we actually want the particles to come off this sphere here. So we're going to use a position object operator. Just put that after the birth. There we go. And now I'm going to add the sphere. And now if I scrub through, you can see as the sphere flies through space, it leaves particles behind. That's pretty easy to see. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to change the birth parameters because I'm not really happy with the way the particles are being born. You can see here at the moment it's set up so particles will start being birthed on frame 0 and will stop being birthed on frame 25. And you can see that it's using an amount. In other words, during that period, a total of 200 particles will be birthed. I'm going to change that to a rate, and I'm also going to change this so that the particles are being born all the way through our animation. So let's change this to 200, and let's change this to rate, and we're going to go for 60 for now. Let's have a look how many particles that actually births. It's really not that many particles, so I'm just going to put that up a little bit so we can see a little bit more. Okay. There we go, so we've got quite a few more particles now, and as it swings back and forth, it keeps on emitting particles all the way towards the end of the animation. So that's pretty cool, that's much better. Now you can see that as the particles are emitted, they're not traveling anywhere, they're not doing anything whatsoever. So you can see as the particles are emitted, they're not actually traveling anywhere. So we need to change that so the particles have some kind of animation, some kind of motion going on. Otherwise, it's really not going to look like a very good simulation of fire. And to do that, I'm going to go to Space Warps, and I'm going to create a gravity, create it here. I'm going to make that gravity into an actual anti-gravity in effect, because the fire isn't actually heavy. It's you know, it's a plasma, it's a gas, and it will actually go upwards rather than downwards. It won't fall onto the floor. It'd be quite strange if you actually saw fire falling onto the floor. So in this case, I'm going to use a negative gravity to make the particles float upwards. To make that actually take effect in the particle flow, we need to add a force. So I'm going to create a force here, and we're going to pop it into the flow. Just pop that in there, and I need to add this gravity. There we go. So now if I scrub through, you can see there we are, the particles are now floating upwards. So it's looking a bit more interesting. Possibly at the moment a little bit too slow, so let's just increase the strength of that. There we go. And the other thing you can see that's happening is the particles are actually living for a very long time, so our flame is actually an extremely long stream of particles. So if I look upwards, you can see they're just going off into the sky, so to speak. So not an effect I really want to see. So to get around that, I'm actually going to kill the particles after a certain age. So I'm going to grab a delete operator from here, and I'm going to pop it here in a new event, and I'm going to put an age test into this event. Here we go, there's an age test. And I'm going to say, forget subframe sampling for now, forget variation. I'm going to say the particles only live for 25 frames a second. 25 frames make up a second, so let's say our particles live for a second and a half. So we'll go for something like 37 frames. So basically we're doing a test here. We're saying if the particle age is greater than 37 frames, then this test is true. When this test is true, we then pass the particles that are correct for that test into this event. Now in this event I don't actually want them to be displayed because they're being killed, so I'll get rid of the display operator. There we go. And if we scrub now, you'll see that the particles are not dying. Ah yes, they are actually dying. But you can see they're living for quite a while, so we'll make their death a little bit more hurried. Let's change this to 14. There we go. And